Hey everyone, settle in tonight as we explore one of the most profound environmental transformations in modern history. This is the story of what happened after the reactors stopped burning, after the dust settled, and after the last buses carried people away from their homes. It's a story about evacuation, exclusion, adaptation, and unexpected resilience. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into history's quieter moments, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what draws you to stories like these. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step into the strange, silent world that emerged from catastrophe. On the morning of April 26, 1986, most residents of Pripyat woke to an ordinary Saturday. The city was young, barely 16 years old, built specifically to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families. It was a model Soviet city, a place of carefully planned prosperity with tree-lined streets, cultural centers, schools designed for thousands of children, and an amusement park that was scheduled to open in just 5 days for May Day celebrations. The Ferris wheel stood ready, painted bright yellow, waiting for the laughter of children who would never ride it. Nobody in Pripyat knew that during the night, while they slept, reactor number 4 had exploded with such force that it blew off a 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid as if it were made of paper. The explosion itself was not nuclear in the traditional sense. It was a steam explosion, a catastrophic failure of physics and safety protocols that resulted from a poorly designed experiment conducted by operators who didn't fully understand the danger they were creating. When technicians attempted to simulate cooling the reactor during a blackout, they disabled safety systems and withdrew control rods while allowing the reactor to run at just 7% power. This combination of factors, coupled with a fundamental design flaw in the RBMK reactor itself, created conditions for an uncontrollable chain reaction. At 1:23 in the morning, the reactor core exploded. 2 workers died immediately. The graphite moderator, which helped sustain the nuclear reaction, caught fire and would continue burning for days, sending radioactive particles high into the atmosphere where wind currents carried them across Europe and beyond. Yet for hours, the city continued as if nothing had changed. Children played in parks. Wedding parties gathered for photographs. Gardeners tended their plots. The explosion had been heard, certainly, and some people noticed the strange glow coming from the direction of the power plant, a blue light that seemed to pulse against the darkness. A few curious residents walked to bridges and rooftops to get a better view, exposing themselves to radiation doses that would later prove fatal. But official silence created a vacuum filled with rumors and confusion rather than facts. The plant's director had not even bothered to attend the safety test. When the accident occurred, he was at home, and the immediate response was characterized more by disbelief than decisive action. Moscow was notified, certainly, but the full scale of the disaster was minimized, misunderstood, or deliberately obscured depending on who was speaking and what they knew. By Saturday afternoon, people in Pripyat began to feel unwell. Headaches appeared first, then metallic tastes in mouths that wouldn't go away no matter how much water people drank. Nausea followed, then uncontrollable coughing and vomiting. These were the early symptoms of radiation exposure, though most residents had no context for understanding what was happening to their bodies. The Soviet system, built on secrecy and centralized control, was not designed to rapidly disseminate information about technological failures, especially one of this magnitude. So people waited, increasingly anxious, as Saturday stretched into Sunday and still no official announcement came. Firefighters and plant workers, meanwhile, were already dying. The men who responded first to extinguish the fires on the roof of the reactor hall absorbed radiation doses so intense that their bodies began breaking down at the cellular level within hours. 28 would die within 3 months from acute radiation syndrome, their deaths agonizing and prolonged as bone marrow failed, immune systems collapsed, and organs shut down one by one. It was not until Sunday afternoon, more than 36 hours after the explosion, that authorities finally decided evacuation was necessary. Even then, the announcement was carefully worded to avoid panic. Loudspeakers crackled to life across Pripyat just after 1 in the afternoon, and a calm voice informed residents that due to an accident at the Chernobyl power station, radioactive conditions in the vicinity were deteriorating. The Communist Party and armed forces were taking necessary steps to combat this, the voice explained, but to keep people safe and healthy, especially children, a temporary evacuation would begin at 2 that afternoon. Each apartment block would have buses at its disposal, supervised by police and city officials. Residents were advised to bring documents, vital personal belongings, and some food, just in case. The key word was temporary. People were told they would be gone for approximately 3 days, maybe a week at most. This was the number repeated by officials, police, and local chairmen, a figure that seemed to come from civil defense protocols which assumed that in the event of a nuclear strike, radioactivity would decrease to minimum permissible rates within 72 hours. But this was not a nuclear weapon. This was a reactor fire releasing radionuclides that would remain dangerous for decades, centuries, or in some cases thousands of years. The evacuation itself was executed with remarkable efficiency once it began. Over 1,000 buses had been gathered from across the Soviet Union, converging on this small Ukrainian city in a convoy that seemed endless. By 1:50 in the afternoon, residents began gathering near their apartment buildings where buses waited in neat rows. The convoys departed every 10 minutes, 20 buses, and 5 trucks at a time, moving in synchronized waves. In just 2.5 hours, 47,500 people were transported out of Pripyat, leaving behind a city that was still running, still lit, still warm with the life that had just departed. Police went through homes afterward and found 20 more residents who had tried to avoid evacuation, people who perhaps sensed that temporary meant something very different than what they were being told. What people left behind tells its own story. Apartments preserved exactly as they were on that Sunday afternoon. Breakfast dishes still on tables. Laundry hanging to dry on balconies. School textbooks open to the pages children had been studying. Toys scattered across bedroom floors. Wedding photographs in frames. Letters half written. The amusement park with its Ferris wheel and bumper cars, never used, never opened, frozen 5 days before its scheduled debut. Residents took almost nothing because they believed they would return. A single suitcase per family. Documents and a change of clothes. Perhaps some food. Anything more seemed unnecessary for 3 days away. Even pets were forbidden. Eyewitnesses later recalled the heartbreaking sight of dogs chasing buses down the road, barking and whining as if they understood that this departure was different, permanent, that the people they loved were not coming back. The evacuees were transported to nearby towns and villages where they were distributed among local families. Chairman met the buses with lists of names, assigning refugees to households with a practical efficiency that was both impressive and deeply impersonal. These people go to this family. Those people go to that one. Strangers absorbed into the homes of other strangers, fed and sheltered in a massive collective effort that spoke to something admirable about human capacity for mutual aid even as it unfolded within a system that had catastrophically failed its citizens. Many evacuees recall the kindness of those who took them in, the shared meals, the beds offered, the attempts at normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. But Pripyat was only the beginning. 10 days after the accident, officials expanded the evacuation zone from 10 kilometers to 30 kilometers, a circular area encompassing over 1,000 square miles centered on the destroyed reactor. This expansion was described as arbitrary by those involved, a round number chosen more for administrative convenience than scientific precision. Within this zone lived approximately 116,000 people in the immediate aftermath, though the eventual total of evacuated persons would grow much larger. From 1986 to 2000, the number of permanently resettled persons from the most severely contaminated areas would reach approximately 350,000 people across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Entire villages disappeared. Towns that had existed for centuries were emptied in a matter of days. The ancient settlement of Chernobyl itself, founded in the 11th century and home to 7,000 people, was evacuated along with 187 smaller villages. Agricultural communities that had farmed the same land for generations were relocated to unfamiliar territories. The social fabric of entire regions was torn apart as families scattered, communities dissolved, and traditional ways of life ended abruptly. The creation of the exclusion zone was formalized on May 2, 1986, when a Soviet government commission headed by Nikolai Ryzhkov officially designated the 30-kilometer radius from Reactor 4 as the Chernobyl nuclear power plant zone of alienation. The zone was placed under military control, with checkpoints established and armed guards deployed to prevent unauthorized entry. Initially, it was divided into 3 subzones based on contamination levels and proximity to the reactor. The area immediately adjacent to Reactor 4 was the most dangerous, a place where even brief exposure carried severe health risks. The 10-kilometer radius formed a second zone where contamination was intense but slightly less extreme. The remaining area out to the 30-kilometer boundary completed the exclusion zone, though contamination patterns followed the whims of wind and rain rather than neat circular boundaries. Radiation does not respect geometry. Hotspots appeared in unexpected places while other areas much closer to the reactor showed lower readings. The entire system of classification and control was an attempt to impose order on something fundamentally chaotic. Over the following months and years, the borders of the exclusion zone were adjusted as scientists gained better understanding of contamination patterns. Radiation surveys revealed isolated pockets of high contamination well outside the original 30-kilometer circle, forcing additional evacuations and creating a zone that resembled less a perfect circle and more an irregular patchwork shaped by meteorological conditions during the critical first days after the explosion. The zone was later subdivided into color-coded areas. The black zone, with radiation levels over 200 microsieverts per hour, was designated for permanent exclusion with no return permitted for evacuees. The red zone, where readings fell between 50 and 200 microsieverts per hour, was considered an area where people might eventually return once radiation levels normalized. The yellow zone represented lower contamination areas subject to rigorous monitoring, from which children and pregnant women were moved as a precaution. In November 1986, control over activities within the zone was transferred to a new production association called Kombinat, based in the evacuated city of Chernobyl. This organization bore responsibility for operating the remaining reactors at the power plant, decontaminating the 30-kilometer zone, supplying materials and goods to workers inside the zone, and constructing housing outside the zone for power plant personnel and their families. A new city called Slavutic was built to replace Pripyat, complete with a direct rail connection to the Chernobyl plant. This settlement would house the workers who continued to operate reactors 1, 2, and 3 for years after the disaster, because despite the catastrophe at Reactor 4, the Soviet Union could not afford to lose the electrical generating capacity of the remaining units. Reactor 2 operated until 1991 when a fire forced its closure. Reactor 1 continued until 1996. Reactor 3, incredibly, operated until the year 2000, finally shutting down in an official ceremony that marked the end of power generation at Chernobyl. While the exclusion zone was being established and evacuations continued, an equally urgent crisis was unfolding at Reactor 4 itself. The graphite fire continued burning, releasing radiation constantly into the atmosphere. Scientists estimated that between 50 and 185 million curies of radioactive material were released, several times more than the combined atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The cloud of contamination spread across Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and eventually much of Europe. Sweden detected the radiation first. On April 28, 2 days after the explosion, radiation alarms at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers from Chernobyl, began sounding. Workers there initially assumed their own plant was leaking. Only after investigation did Swedish authorities determine the contamination came from elsewhere. They correlated enhanced radiation levels across Europe with wind patterns and announced to the world that a nuclear accident had occurred somewhere in the Soviet Union. This revelation forced Moscow's hand. Soviet officials had been conducting emergency operations but had deliberately chosen not to report the accident or its scale. Only after Sweden's announcement did the Soviet government publicly acknowledge that something had happened, though even then they falsely claimed the situation was under control. The effort to contain the burning reactor required desperate measures and extraordinary sacrifice. Starting on April 27, helicopter pilots began dropping materials onto the exposed reactor core. Sand, boron, lead, clay, and dolomite were released from helicopters flying directly over the burning wreckage. Between April 27 and May 1, about 1,800 helicopter flights deposited over 5,000 metric tons of material onto Reactor 4. The pilots flew through plumes of radioactive smoke, exposing themselves to radiation doses that would cause long-term health consequences for many. It was later determined that virtually none of the neutron-absorbing boron actually reached the core. The material mostly piled up around the edges or was blown away by the updraft from the fire. But the operation continued because doing nothing seemed worse than doing something, even if that something was largely ineffective. By May 10, the graphite fire finally exhausted itself. But the damaged reactor remained an open wound releasing contamination. The solution was to build a structure over it, a protective shell that would contain the radioactive material and shield workers operating the other reactors. This became known as the sarcophagus, and its construction was a race against time and radiation. Workers, known as liquidators, labored in extremely high radiation environments. They worked in brief shifts, sometimes just minutes long, because longer exposure would deliver dangerous doses. Some worked remotely using machinery. Others had no choice but to approach the reactor directly, shoveling radioactive debris, sealing openings, welding metal plates, pouring concrete. The sarcophagus was completed in just over 206 days, an engineering achievement accomplished through the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers at enormous cost to their health. The structure was never intended as a permanent solution. It was built quickly under emergency conditions to provide immediate containment and radiological protection for the crews operating the undamaged reactors. Over time, it began deteriorating, developing cracks and structural weaknesses. In 2016, a massive new safe confinement structure was completed and slid over the old sarcophagus on rails. This new structure, weighing 32,000 tons and costing $2.3 billion, is designed to contain the reactor remains for at least a century while cleanup operations continue inside. The radioactive material will be removed eventually, though that process is not expected to be completed until 2065. The health consequences of the disaster unfolded over years and decades, revealing the complex ways radiation affects human bodies. 28 plant workers and firefighters died within 3 months from acute radiation syndrome, their deaths marking the immediate toll. But radiation's long-term effects are more insidious, manifesting years later in populations that seemed initially unharmed. The most significant health impact has been thyroid cancer, particularly among children and adolescents who were exposed to radioactive iodine released during the accident. When the reactor exploded, isotopes of iodine were among the many radioactive materials released into the atmosphere. Iodine-131 has a relatively short half-life of just 8 days, but during that time it poses extreme danger because the human thyroid gland efficiently absorbs and concentrates iodine from the environment. Children are especially vulnerable. Their thyroid glands are smaller and their metabolisms faster, leading to higher radiation doses per unit of absorbed iodine. In the weeks following the accident, radioactive iodine fell onto grass and crops. Dairy cattle ate contaminated vegetation and concentrated the iodine in their milk. Children drank that milk, delivering radioactive iodine directly to their thyroid glands where it irradiated tissue at close range. By 2005, approximately 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer had occurred among people who were children at the time of the accident. Around 5,000 of these cases are attributed specifically to drinking fresh contaminated milk in the weeks after the disaster. 15 proved fatal, though this number reflects the fact that thyroid cancer, while serious, is often treatable when detected early. In the Gomel region of Belarus, one of the most heavily contaminated areas, the incidence of pediatric thyroid cancer rose dramatically. By 1995, 9 years after the disaster, the rate had reached 100 cases per million children per year, far above normal background rates. The children who survived these cancers may remain at elevated risk even as adults, decades after their initial exposure. Long-term monitoring continues as researchers work to understand the full scope of delayed health effects. Beyond thyroid cancer, evidence for other radiation-related health impacts is more uncertain. Among the roughly 600 workers who were on site during the accident, 134 developed acute radiation syndrome. For those who survived the initial crisis, increased rates of leukemia and cataracts have been documented. However, for workers who received lower doses, no clear increase in solid cancers or leukemia has been observed. In the general population of affected areas, the story grows more complicated. Some studies suggested possible increases in breast cancer and other malignancies, but these findings have not been conclusively linked to radiation exposure. Psychological impacts, however, have been unambiguous and severe. Stress, anxiety, fear of radiation, the trauma of forced relocation, breaking of social bonds, economic hardship, and loss of traditional livelihoods have affected hundreds of thousands of people. These psychological consequences often proved more damaging to quality of life than measurable radiation exposure, creating a health crisis that medical treatment alone could not address. Meanwhile, in the exclusion zone itself, something unexpected was happening. Nature was returning. With humans gone, wildlife began reclaiming the land. This process started almost immediately after evacuation. Domestic animals left behind either died or adapted to feral existence. Most livestock and pets were removed or culled to prevent the spread of contamination, but some horses left on an island in the Pripyat River died when radiation destroyed their thyroid glands. Other animals on the same island survived but showed signs of stunting and abnormality. Yet the second generation appeared largely normal, suggesting that survivors possessed genetic resilience or that the most vulnerable individuals had already been removed from the population. Wild animals faced no such removal efforts. Radiation affected them, certainly, especially in the immediate aftermath when contamination levels were highest. The pine forest nearest the plant absorbed such intense radiation that all the trees died, turning red before being bulldozed and buried. This area became known as the Red Forest, named for the color of the dead pines. Within the first months, mortality was observed among soil invertebrates, small mammals, and birds in the most contaminated areas. Mutation rates increased by a factor of 20 due to radionuclide exposure. On farms near the exclusion zone, between 1986 and 1990, nearly 350 animals were reportedly born with gross deformities, compared to just 3 abnormal births in the 5 years prior. These were the immediate, visible consequences of radiation's disrupting force on living systems. But over time, a different pattern emerged. with no humans hunting them, developing their habitat, or driving vehicles through their territory, animal populations began to expand. Studies conducted in the exclusion zone, particularly on the Belarusian side, found that populations of boar, elk, and roe deer exploded between 1987 and 1996. By the mid-1990s, wolves became so numerous they were a nuisance to farmers on the zone's edges. Over the following decades, the exclusion zone transformed into what scientists now consider the third largest nature reserve in mainland Europe. Species rarely seen in densely populated areas began appearing. Brown bears were documented. Eurasian lynx returned. European bison, an endangered species, established viable populations. Przelsky's horses, introduced as part of rewilding efforts, roamed through clearings and passed radiation warning signs. More than 200 bird species have been observed, including rare and protected species like white-tailed eagles, golden eagles, and black storks. Scientists conducting wildlife surveys using camera traps and track monitoring have documented an extraordinary diversity of life. In one 5-week survey period, cameras captured images of bison, 60 raccoon dogs, 26 gray wolves, 21 wild boars, 9 badgers, and 10 red foxes, along with numerous other species. Researchers describe being unable to go anywhere in certain parts of the zone without seeing wolves, an observation that would be impossible in virtually any other European location outside of protected wilderness areas. This resurgence has sparked intense scientific debate. Some researchers argue that wildlife populations are thriving precisely because the burden of human activity is more severe than the burden of radiation. The absence of roads cutting through habitat, hunting pressure, agricultural development, pollution, noise, and the countless other ways humans degrade environments has created space for wild populations to recover despite elevated radiation levels. Other scientists point to evidence of individual-level impacts. Some insects appear to have shorter lifespans and higher rates of parasitism in high-radiation areas. Some birds show increased rates of albinism and genetic abnormalities in heavily contaminated localities. Ongoing research has documented physiological changes, potential adaptive responses, and continuing investigation into how chronic low-dose radiation affects wild populations over multiple generations. The fact that both observations can be true simultaneously reveals something important about ecological systems. They are complex, resilient, and capable of adaptation in ways that resist simple narratives. The exclusion zone is neither a thriving wildlife paradise untouched by contamination nor a barren wasteland devoid of life. It is something more nuanced, a landscape where radiation has clear biological impacts but where those impacts have not prevented population-level recovery. For some species, this recovery has been dramatic enough to support the claim that the zone has become an unexpected haven. For others, subtle damage accumulates across generations in ways that are harder to measure but no less real. What seems clear is that in the medium term, the cessation of human activity has provided more benefit to wildlife populations than radiation has provided harm. This is not a vindication of nuclear accidents but rather a stark commentary on how intensely human civilization typically pressures the natural world. Some wildlife in the zone has shown intriguing signs that might represent adaptive responses to radiation exposure. Frogs inside the exclusion zone, for instance, are darker than frogs living outside it, a possible defensive adaptation since melanin provides some protection against radiation damage. Whether this represents true evolutionary adaptation or simply natural selection favoring individuals who happen to possess protective traits is still being investigated. Regardless, the observation raises questions about how quickly populations might adapt to radioactive environments and what that could mean for understanding long-term consequences of contamination. Similarly, studies of microorganisms suggest that bacterial and viral populations within the zone may have developed radiation tolerance, though research in this area remains limited. The exclusion zone has become a living laboratory for studying questions about radiation biology, population genetics, ecosystem dynamics, and species resilience that cannot be investigated anywhere else on Earth. From a policy perspective, Chernobyl's aftermath forced fundamental reconsiderations of nuclear safety worldwide. The accident was a watershed moment that exposed critical flaws in reactor design, operational procedures, safety culture, and international cooperation around nuclear technology. The RBMK reactor design was inherently unstable under certain conditions, a fact that operators were not adequately informed about. The experiment conducted on April 26 violated multiple safety protocols, and the operators carrying it out did not fully understand the physics of what they were attempting. There was no containment structure, no concrete and steel dome designed to trap radioactive material inside the plant in the event of catastrophic failure. When the reactor exploded, nothing prevented the release of contamination into the atmosphere. These were not unique failures specific to the Soviet system, though Soviet secrecy and Cold War isolation certainly contributed to the disaster's severity. Some of the lessons from Chernobyl apply to reactor designs used in Western countries as well. In the months following the accident, the International Atomic Energy Agency held conferences where scientists and policymakers grappled with what had happened and what needed to change. Early assessments blamed operators for violating procedures, but later analysis, particularly the IAEA's INSAG 7 report published in 1992, shifted focus to fundamental reactor design flaws. Both operator error and design deficiency contributed to the accident, but underlying both was an inadequate safety culture at managerial and operational levels. The term safety culture was actually coined in response to Chernobyl, describing the shared values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that influence how safety is managed within an organization. Chernobyl revealed severe deficiencies in this culture within Soviet nuclear programs, including lack of openness, reluctance to question authority, and tendency to prioritize production over safety. These cultural problems were systemic, extending beyond any single plant or group of operators. In response, the international community developed new legal frameworks and cooperation mechanisms. The Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident was adopted specifically to address the fact that Soviet officials had delayed informing other countries about the contamination spreading across Europe. Under this convention, nations agreed to notify neighboring countries promptly in the event of accidents that could have transboundary radiological consequences. The Convention on Assistance in the Case of a Nuclear Accident or Radiological Emergency established protocols for requesting and providing international aid during nuclear crises. Most significantly, the Convention on Nuclear Safety was developed as a treaty to promote nuclear reactor safety worldwide. These agreements marked a fundamental shift in how the international community approached nuclear risk, acknowledging that an accident anywhere could be an accident everywhere due to atmospheric dispersion of contamination. Beyond legal conventions, practical assistance flowed from Western countries and international organizations to improve safety at Soviet-designed reactors still operating in Eastern Europe and former Soviet republics. Equipment, training for operators and regulators, analytical simulators, firefighting gear, and expertise were provided to help upgrade facilities and ensure personnel were prepared if emergencies occurred. Funding and technical support helped establish better monitoring systems, safety protocols, and regulatory oversight. These efforts reflected recognition that global nuclear safety required addressing vulnerabilities wherever they existed, regardless of geopolitical boundaries. The Chernobyl disaster also influenced how nuclear power was perceived more broadly in discussions about energy policy and climate change. Some countries responded by abandoning or limiting nuclear programs. Others doubled down on safety improvements while maintaining nuclear power as part of their energy mix. The debate intensified around questions of acceptable risk, the ethics of managing radioactive waste that remains dangerous for thousands of years, and whether nuclear power's low-carbon benefits justify its catastrophic failure potential. These discussions continue today and will continue for as long as nuclear reactors operate anywhere on Earth. For the people who were evacuated from their homes near Chernobyl, the aftermath has been measured in disrupted lives, lost communities, and struggles to rebuild in unfamiliar places. The promise that evacuation was temporary dissolved quickly as reality became clear. For most, there would be no return. Homes were left to decay. Possessions gathered dust or were looted by intruders who infiltrated the zone despite military control. Personal histories contained in photo albums, letters, and memorabilia were lost. The psychological toll of this forced displacement, combined with fear about radiation's effects on health, created widespread anxiety and stress that persisted for decades. Many evacuees struggled economically. Agricultural communities were particularly hard hit, losing land they had farmed for generations and finding it difficult to establish new livelihoods elsewhere. The breaking of social bonds that had sustained communities for centuries left people isolated in ways that purely material compensation could never address. However, not everyone left. A small population of people, primarily elderly residents, defied evacuation orders and returned to live in the exclusion zone. These individuals, known as Samosli, or self-settlers, number fewer than 200 as of recent counts and are declining steadily as they age. In 1986, an estimated 1,200 people were living unofficially within the zone. By 2007, that number had dropped to 314. The current population is estimated at around 197 people living in 11 villages and the town of Chernobyl itself. Their average age is over 63. These residents are senior citizens who chose to return to their ancestral homes rather than adapt to life elsewhere. Many express a deep connection to the land and a preference for the familiar risks of radiation over the unfamiliar hardships of displacement. Authorities initially attempted to prevent returns but eventually relented, allowing elderly residents to stay while discouraging younger people from joining them. The Somosli maintain small gardens, keep livestock, and live in conditions that resemble rural life from decades past, aware that they are the last generation who will inhabit these villages. Meanwhile, the exclusion zone has developed its own strange economy and culture. Decommissioning work at the power plant continues, employing workers who enter and leave the zone on strict rotation schedules to limit radiation exposure. Scientists conduct ongoing research on wildlife, contamination, and ecosystem dynamics. A limited tourism industry has emerged, offering carefully controlled visits to the zone under official supervision. Guides lead groups through abandoned villages and past warning signs, into the ghost town of Pripyat where buildings slowly collapse and trees push up through pavement. The amusement park's yellow Ferris wheel has become an iconic image, a symbol of childhood joy forever deferred, a monument to the lives that might have been lived if not for one catastrophic night. Visitors pass through military-style checkpoints at the 30-kilometer boundary and again at the 10-kilometer line and at the entrance to Pripyat itself. Names and passport numbers must be submitted to authorities 7 to 10 days in advance. Radiation screening occurs at each checkpoint when exiting. If contamination levels are too high, clothing and boots must be washed or abandoned. Taking anything out of the zone is forbidden. These tours walk a strange line between education and spectacle, between remembrance and exploitation. They offer the only way most people will ever witness what remains when a modern city is abandoned mid-breath. Some areas of the zone are now designated as nature reserves, recognition that whatever the zone represents in terms of human tragedy, it has become ecologically valuable. In 2016, Ukraine declared part of the exclusion zone the Chernobyl Radiation and Environmental Biosphere Reserve, dedicated to conserving the wildlife that has returned. Belarus established the Polsy State Radio-Ecological Reserve on its side of the contaminated region, creating together what amounts to the third largest nature reserve in mainland Europe. These protected areas support populations of species that have disappeared from more developed regions. They provide opportunities for research into ecosystem recovery, radiation ecology, and conservation biology that would be impossible elsewhere. In a grim irony, the accident that made the land uninhabitable for humans has made it a refuge for wildlife. Yet contamination remains. The half-life of cesium-137, one of the most harmful isotopes released, is approximately 30 years. That means that 30 years after the accident, in 2016, half of the cesium-137 had decayed. But half remained, and it will take another 30 years for half of that remainder to decay, and so on for generations. Other isotopes have even longer half-lives. Plutonium isotopes remain dangerous for thousands of years. Some areas within the zone will not be safe for human habitation for centuries or potentially millennia. Monitoring continues. Radiation levels are mapped and tracked. Groundwater is tested. Soil samples are analyzed. The work is painstaking and will continue far longer than the lifetimes of anyone alive when the accident occurred. Predictions vary about when the zone might be habitable again. Some estimates suggest it could take 20,000 years before radiation levels decline to naturally occurring background levels in the most contaminated areas. Others are more optimistic about partial rehabilitation of less affected regions. The truth is that nobody knows with certainty because humanity has never before had to wait for land this contaminated to become safe again. Environmental lessons from Chernobyl extend beyond radiation specifically to broader questions about technological risk and environmental management. The accident demonstrated that catastrophic failures of complex technological systems can have consequences that persist for time scales usually associated with geological processes. It showed that radioactive contamination can render land unusable far more quickly than natural processes can restore it. It revealed vulnerabilities in how societies assess and communicate risk, particularly when political considerations interfere with scientific transparency. The delayed evacuation, the withholding of information about contamination, the failure to distribute potassium iodide tablets that could have blocked thyroid absorption of radioactive iodine, all of these decisions compounded the health impacts and reflected institutional failures as significant as the technical failures that caused the explosion. The exclusion zone also raises profound questions about value and recovery. Is a forest growing over abandoned homes a success or a tragedy? When wildlife populations increase because humans have been removed, is that environmental recovery or simply ecological opportunism filling a vacuum? How do we weigh the return of bears and eagles against the forced displacement of tens of thousands of people? These questions resist simple answers. The zone is simultaneously a testament to nature's resilience and a reminder of human capacity for irreversible harm. It represents both the cost of technological failure and the surprising adaptability of life. Walking through Pripyat today, nature is everywhere. Trees grow through apartment buildings. Vines cover Soviet murals. Moss softens concrete. Birds nest in abandoned factories. The city is being disassembled by wind and rain and roots, returning gradually to the forest from which it was carved. This process will continue for decades, maybe centuries, until almost nothing remains of the human presence except perhaps some foundations and the faint radioactive signature in the soil. For those who study Chernobyl, whether as scientists, historians, or policymakers, the disaster offers lessons that remain urgently relevant. Nuclear technology demands not just technical competence but institutional wisdom, cultural openness, and genuine commitment to safety over expediency. It requires international cooperation because contamination respects no borders. It demands honest communication because public trust cannot be rebuilt after being shattered by secrecy. It necessitates humility because the consequences of failure exceed any individual's or institution's capacity to fully control or remediate. These lessons applied not only to nuclear power but to any technology that concentrates enough energy or toxic potential to cause widespread harm. Climate change, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, each of these domains presents similar challenges around managing low probability, high consequence risks in systems too complex for any single entity to fully understand or control. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is simply this: places and lives can be changed irrevocably in moments, but the consequences unfold across generations. The people who lived in Pripyat in 1986 could not have known that their ordinary Saturday morning would be the last time they would wake in their homes. The children playing in parks that day are now middle-aged, living lives in cities they never chose, carrying memories of a place they can visit only as tourists in their own past. Their children, born after the disaster, grow up with family histories interrupted by evacuation, with grandparents who speak of a city that no longer exists as a place of life. The exclusion zone will outlast everyone who remembers it inhabited. It will remain long after the last of the liquidators has died, long after the last Samosli has passed, long after everyone who lived through April 26, 1986, has become memory themselves. And yet life continues, in the zone and beyond it. Forests grow. Animals thrive. Seeds sprout in the cracks of abandoned buildings. Water flows through contaminated rivers, eventually mixing with clean water downstream. Slowly, impossibly slowly, radiation decays. The elements transform, half-life by half-life, into more stable forms. Nature processes the disaster in its own time, at its own pace, indifferent to human timelines or anxieties. The story of Chernobyl's aftermath is still being written. The new safe confinement structure shelters the damaged reactor but represents only a temporary solution in a problem that will persist for millennia. Inside, highly radioactive materials remain, waiting for future generations to develop technologies capable of safely removing and storing them. The cleanup process, begun in 1986, continues today and will continue for decades more. Workers still enter the zone daily, monitoring radiation, maintaining infrastructure, and slowly dismantling what was once the pride of Soviet nuclear engineering. The work is dangerous, necessary, and will outlast the careers of everyone currently involved. Research continues as well, though funding has decreased as the disaster recedes into history. Scientists still study how radiation affects organisms across multiple generations. They track mutation rates, population dynamics, and physiological adaptations in wildlife. They monitor contamination levels in soil, water, and vegetation. They model how radioactive materials move through ecosystems, from soil to plants to herbivores to predators to decomposers and back into soil again in endless cycles that will continue long after monitoring ends. This research has implications beyond the exclusion zone itself, informing how scientists understand radiation biology, environmental recovery, and ecosystem resilience. It provides data for risk assessment models used worldwide in nuclear safety planning. It offers insights into how life adapts to extreme stresses, knowledge that might prove valuable as humanity faces other environmental crises in coming decades. International cooperation, sparked by the disaster, has evolved into permanent institutions and agreements that shape global nuclear governance today. The conventions on early notification and assistance remain in force, activated occasionally when accidents occur at nuclear facilities anywhere in the world. The Convention on Nuclear Safety continues to promote high safety standards globally, though its effectiveness depends entirely on voluntary compliance and national commitment. The legacy of Chernobyl is embedded in these frameworks, a ghost at the table during every discussion of nuclear risk, a reminder of what happens when safety culture fails. For the nations most affected, particularly Ukraine and Belarus, Chernobyl remains a defining event that shaped politics, economics, and national identity. The disaster contributed to the Soviet Union's collapse by revealing fundamental failures of the system and eroding public trust in authorities. It created enormous financial burdens, as governments were forced to spend billions on evacuation, resettlement, compensation, healthcare, and ongoing management of contaminated areas. These costs continue today, decades later, draining resources that could be used for other purposes. The disaster also created a class of people defined by their relationship to it: liquidators who worked to contain the catastrophe, evacuees who lost their homes, children who developed thyroid cancer, families torn apart by displacement and illness. For these people, Chernobyl is not historical abstraction. It is lived experience, woven into personal biographies and family histories in ways that statistics can never capture. Memory of the disaster is preserved through memorials, museums, and annual commemorations. In Ukraine, April 26 is an official day of remembrance of the Chernobyl tragedy, marked with ceremonies and moments of silence. Museums in Kiev and other cities display artifacts from the disaster, photographs of Pripyat before and after, personal testimonies from survivors, and educational exhibits about radiation and nuclear safety. These institutions work to ensure that future generations understand what happened and why it matters. Yet memory is fragile. As time passes and those who experience the disaster firsthand die, direct connection to the event weakens. The story risks becoming simplified, mythologized, or forgotten entirely. This is why documentation matters, why oral histories are recorded, why films and books continue to explore the disaster from different angles. Without deliberate effort to preserve memory, the lessons risk being lost. Popular culture has shaped public perception of Chernobyl in complex ways. The HBO miniseries Chernobyl, broadcast in 2019, brought renewed global attention to the disaster, dramatizing events with vivid intensity and emotional power. The series reached audiences who knew little about the accident, educating millions while also taking creative liberties that sparked debate about historical accuracy versus narrative impact. Tourism to the exclusion zone increased significantly following the series, as viewers wanted to see the locations they had watched on screen. This surge created ethical tensions around whether visiting Chernobyl represents respectful remembrance or morbid spectacle. For guides and local authorities, the challenge has been balancing increased interest and revenue against the need to maintain dignity and educational purpose. The zone is not a theme park, though it risks being treated as one when visitors approach it primarily as exotic destination rather than site of tragedy. Literature has also played a role in shaping how Chernobyl is remembered. Svetlana Alexievica's book Voices from Chernobyl, published in 1997, collected oral testimonies from hundreds of people affected by the disaster, creating a chorus of individual voices that resists official narratives and statistical abstractions. The book, which won Alexievich the Nobel Prize in Literature, presents the disaster through the experiences of those who lived it: firefighters' wives watching their husbands die from radiation, evacuees describing the moment they left their homes forever, liquidators recounting work so dangerous it defied comprehension. These testimonies preserve the human dimension of catastrophe, ensuring that behind every number, every REM of radiation exposure, every hectare of contaminated land, stand real people whose lives were irrevocably altered. Artists have responded to Chernobyl in varied ways, creating works that explore themes of loss, contamination, memory, and resilience. Photographers have documented the zone's decay and wildlife return, producing haunting images of nature reclaiming human spaces. Filmmakers have created documentaries and fiction films examining different aspects of the disaster and its aftermath. Musicians have composed pieces inspired by the exclusion zone's eerie silence and the weight of its history. Visual artists have used materials and imagery from Chernobyl to explore questions about environmental destruction, technological hubris, and temporal scale. This cultural production ensures that Chernobyl remains present in collective consciousness, even as temporal distance increases. Yet for all the attention the disaster receives, certain voices and experiences remain marginalized. Workers who labored as liquidators, often receiving dangerous radiation doses while performing essential decontamination work, have struggled for recognition and compensation. Many were not adequately informed about the risks they faced. Many developed health problems they believe stem from their exposure but cannot definitively prove. Their sacrifice made it possible to contain the disaster and prevent greater catastrophe, yet their suffering often goes unacknowledged in official narratives that focus on heroism or victimhood rather than exploitation and systemic failure. Similarly, communities in less famous contaminated areas, places that received significant fallout but were not evacuated, have lived for decades with uncertainty about health risks, economic limitations due to agricultural restrictions, and social stigma associated with coming from contaminated regions. Their experiences differ from those of evacuees or liquidators, yet are no less real or deserving of attention. The ethical dimensions of Chernobyl continue to generate difficult questions. What obligations do we have to people harmed by technologies they did not consent to or benefit from? How should responsibility be distributed among operators who violated procedures, designers who created flawed reactors, managers who prioritized production over safety, and governments that fostered cultures of secrecy? To what extent can or should nations that benefited from Soviet nuclear power assist with ongoing costs of managing the disaster's legacy? How do we weigh the lives disrupted against the broader context of energy needs and development goals that drove nuclear expansion in the first place? These questions lack clear answers, but asking them forces engagement with fundamental issues about technological risk, social justice, and intergenerational responsibility. Education about Chernobyl has become part of how societies teach about nuclear technology and environmental risk more broadly. Students around the world learn about the disaster in science classes, history courses, and environmental studies programs. The event serves as a case study in engineering ethics, crisis management, risk communication, and the challenges of governing complex technological systems. Yet what students learn varies dramatically depending on where and when they study. In some contexts, Chernobyl is presented primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of nuclear power, evidence that the technology is inherently too risky to use. In others, it is framed as a story of Soviet failures that modern safety cultures and reactor designs have overcome, leaving nuclear power as a viable low-carbon energy source. Both interpretations contain elements of truth, but neither captures the full complexity. A more nuanced understanding recognizes that Chernobyl represents failures at multiple levels: design, operation, culture, communication, and governance. It demonstrates that even with redundant safety systems, accidents can occur when human factors are ignored or when systems are not designed with sufficient conservatism. It shows that transparency and international cooperation are essential for managing technologies whose failures have transboundary consequences. It reveals that the true costs of nuclear accidents extend far beyond immediate casualties to include long-term health effects, environmental contamination, social disruption, economic burden, and psychological trauma across affected populations. And it reminds us that some consequences persist on time scales that dwarf human lifetimes, creating obligations for societies to manage radioactive waste and contaminated environments across centuries or millennia. As nuclear energy undergoes renewed interest as part of climate change mitigation strategies, Chernobyl's legacy becomes increasingly relevant. Advocates argue that modern reactor designs are fundamentally safer, that regulatory frameworks have improved dramatically, and that the low-carbon benefits of nuclear power outweigh the risks, especially when compared to continued fossil fuel use. Critics respond that while individual reactor safety may have improved, systemic risks remain, including the challenge of radioactive waste management, potential for accidents in aging infrastructure, risks of nuclear proliferation, and economic viability questions that lead to shortcuts and safety compromises. The debate is unlikely to be resolved soon, and perhaps should not be. Wrestling with these tensions, acknowledging both nuclear power's potential benefits and its catastrophic failure risks, is healthier than treating the technology as either savior or demon. What Chernobyl ultimately teaches depends partly on what questions we bring to it. If we ask about reactor safety, we learn that design matters enormously and that operators must understand the systems they control. If we ask about emergency response, we learn that rapid, transparent communication can save lives and that secrecy compounds harm. If we ask about environmental impacts, we learn that radioactive contamination can render land unusable for longer than human societies typically persist, but also that nature proves resilient when given space and time. If we ask about social impacts, we learn that technological disasters disrupt communities and lives in ways that extend far beyond physical damage, creating trauma that echoes across generations. If we ask about institutional responsibility, we learn that complex systems require safety cultures that prioritize caution over production, that empower workers to raise concerns, and that respond honestly when things go wrong. The exclusion zone today stands as monument, laboratory, and warning. It is a place where the consequences of one terrible night continue to unfold in slow motion across decades. It is a refuge for wildlife finding space in human absence. It is a reminder that the land we shape shapes us in turn, and that what we build can be lost far more quickly than it took to create. Pripyat's empty buildings gradually crumbling, the new safe confinement structure gleaming over Reactor 4's remains, forests growing through abandoned villages, the Ferris wheel that never turned, all of these images carry weight that transcends their individual details. They speak to something larger about human ambition, technological power, and the limits of control. If you found this exploration of Chernobyl's aftermath meaningful, Please consider liking this video and subscribing to Candle and Crown Sleep Stories for more deep dives into history's quieter moments. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this story resonated with you, or if there are other historical events you would like to see covered in this format. Until next time, rest well, and may the lessons of the past guide us toward wiser futures.